So the title of my talk is long, Finding Corresponding Constructions in English and Japanese in a TED Talk Parallel Corpus using Frames and Constructions Analysis. In recent years, researchers in the FrameNet community studied building constructicons, that is, a collection of constructional descriptions in individual languages. And moreover, researchers have started discussing building a multilingual constructicon, connecting constructicon resources across languages. Why? To see the variety of constructions across languages and to develop a resource for machine translation systems. And in order to build a multilingual constructicon, we need to align constructions in various languages. And actually, based on the analysis of English, Swedish, and Brazilian Portuguese, Lingfeld et al. 2018 proposed a 4-step comparison of constructions. And their first step is to ask the question, is there a corresponding construction or a set of constructions in the target languages? However, unfortunately, in the case of typologically unrelated languages, such as between Japanese and English, identifying corresponding constructions is quite difficult. For example, what does corresponding mean in terms of structure or in terms of meaning, and what method to adopt for doing the comparison? Okay? And recently, a method called Frames and Constructions Analysis has been proposed. And this method describes meanings and structures of sentences, focusing on the semantic frames evoked by various linguistic expressions in the sentences. It is grounded in the theories of frame semantics and construction grammar. Chulo 2013-17 elsewhere proposed this method as a translation model based on analysis of German and English, namely typologically related languages. And he hypothesizes that ideally the semantic frame of the translation matches that of the original. Building on Chulo's work, Oliver's work, O'Hara 2019 and O'Hara and Okubo 2020 examined whether frames and constructions analysis is a valid methodology to search for and align comparable constructions between Japanese and English, a pair of typologically unrelated languages. The study is preliminary, however, and no study exists that explore the validity of the method in analyzing translations from English to Japanese and of written languages. So the present talk reports on an effort to find corresponding constructions between Japanese and English in a TED Talk parallel corpus using the specific frames and constructions analysis method used in O'Hara 2019 and O'Hara and Okubo 2020. The method focuses on heads of sentences where a head is defined as the most contentful word that most closely denotes the same function as the phrase or clause as a whole. This is a Croft's definition. Analysts have already annotated this corpus with semantic frames and FEs in various languages for multilingual FrameNet, as Oliver just mentioned. The purpose of the paper is twofold. One, to demonstrate the validity of frames and construction analysis as the methodology to search for corresponding constructions in a pair of typologically unrelated languages. And number two, to assess whether the TED Talk parallel corpus is a good starting place to align constructions for building a multilingual constructicon. Okay, And the rest of the talk is organized as shown in this slide. Let me skip this. And so let me start out by explaining more about this methodology. Churro hypothesized that ideally the semantic frames of the translation matches that of the original. As I mentioned earlier, he calls it the primacy of the frame hypothesis. However, often cases of frame mismatches exist between pairs of source and target sentences, and Oliver argued that structural divergence can be a cause of frame mismatch. And in addition to cultural, typological, and perspectival differences. And Oliver also observed that even when a frame mismatch exists because of structural divergence between source and target sentences, the two sentences may still share the same pragmatic function. This observation led to the suggestion that the function of a construction may take precedence over exact frame match. So I and my collaborator applied this method to Japanese and English and examined Japanese and English translation, a Japanese to English translation of a children's storybook. In other words, written language in the genre of narrative. So that work analyzed 674 pairs of sentences, and we identified the semantic frames evoked by the heads of source and target sentences and found 483 pairs of frame mismatches. And among the mismatches, 106 pairs exhibited structural divergence, and among these 106 structural divergence, 55 had the same function. So, in other words, the study found corresponding constructions that share the same pragmatic functions, even in cases of structural divergence and frame mismatches. The results suggested the usefulness of frames and constructions analysis for finding comparable constructions across typologically unrelated languages. Okay. But we want to use this methodology to see whether this methodology is valid for spoken language as well. Okay, and let me next talk about the hypothesis, methodology, and results of the current study. First of all, the hypothesis. First, the TED Talk, Do Schools Kill Creativity? Corpus is a presentation, the talk is a presentation aimed at persuading its audience. So one hypothesis is that the English original transcript would include many constructions that exhibit pragmatic functions. Second, the Japanese version is a translation. So the second hypothesis is that the Japanese translation would contain constructions that exhibit similar pragmatic functions as the English original. Finally, the third hypothesis is the likelihood of finding corresponding English and Japanese constructions sharing the same functions despite showing frame mismatches and structural divergence, because these two languages are known for structural divergence. The methodology, the details of the methodology used are shown on this slide. Number one, head identification. Identify the head of each of the English and Japanese sentence pairs. Oh, by the way, we focused on sentence level grammatical constructions. Number two, frame comparison. Determine the semantic frames evoked by the heads of each of the sentence pairs. Check for frame mismatch. Exclude two kinds of cases from frame mismatch. One is a frame integration, and the other is frame-to-frame relations. Number three, structural comparison. Identify the structure of each of the English and Japanese sentences. and check for English and Japanese structural divergence. And finally, identify the function of the English and Japanese constructions. Okay, so let me talk about the results. Altogether, there were 242 English original sentences analyzed. And sometimes one English sentence was translated into Japanese with more than one sentence. At other times, multiple English sentences were translated into one Japanese sentence. So we concentrated on analyzing sentence pairs in which the English original sentence was more or less straightforwardly translated into Japanese with one sentence. And there are 122 such pairs. And this table analyzes the result in comparison with our earlier study on the children's book. Okay, so there are as shown, the frame mismatch were 75 pairs, and frame mismatches were there were 42 pairs of frame mismatches. And among the 42 mismatches, there are 22 structural divergences, and among the 22 structural divergences, there are 9 functional matches. Okay, and let me briefly go over the actual sentences. Okay. Our first hypothesis was that the English original transcript would contain many constructions that exhibit pragmatic functions. And indeed, the English version of the talk includes sentence structures that focus either the whole or parts of a sentence, such as pseudo-cleft in 1, repetition in 2, emphasis in 3, and cataphor in 4. And second, we expected to find in the Japanese translation constructions with similar pragmatic functions as those of the English original. However, the results refuted the expectation. That is, except for the translation of 4A, which uses cataphor to emphasize a quote from Picasso, none of the Japanese translations of the aforementioned English sentences 1 through 4 had structures that focus the whole or part of the sentence, emphasizing the speaker's claim. Actually, 4A was the only one which was translated with a construction with a focusing pragmatic function. And it's indicated by red on this slide. And our last hypothesis concerned finding English and Japanese constructions that exhibit a structural divergence and frame mismatch, yet have the same pragmatic function. There are instances of such cases, and 5 is an example. The heads of the English and Japanese sentences in 5 are stop and surunja arimasen, do not do, respectively. The English and Japanese structures of the imperial construction and of the surunjanai construction, respectively. The head stop in the English evokes the activity stop frame, while surunja arimasen in Japanese evokes the preventing or letting frame. Finally, both sentences function to order the addressee to stop an activity. Okay, discussion. So I'll focus on 3 issues in discussing the results. Okay, first, it has to do with our second hypothesis. We hypothesized that the Japanese translation would contain constructions that exhibit similar pragmatic functions as in the English original, but it turned out that English sentence structures that focus certain elements were often not translated into Japanese using constructions with similar functions. And it may be a consequence of properties of the genre of the Japanese transcript. While the English version is an actual transcript of the presentation, the Japanese version is an actual transcript of no, sorry. Japanese version is primarily a set of subtitles. That is, captions displayed at the bottom of a screen that translate the English transcript. In fact, the sentences in the Japanese version tend to be short and telegraphic, presumably because of the limited space allocated for subtitles and the requirement to be displayed in sync with the audiovisual information in the video clip. Thus, what makes sense is to think of the Japanese transcript as a set of subtitles, something that should be seen and read together with the video clip as part of multimodal information, not as a translation. Okay, so so that was the first point, and the second issue had to do with the validity of the methodology. Since we were able to find pairs of corresponding constructions in English and Japanese in the transcripts, the 4 steps of the frames and constructions analysis proposed seem useful in analyzing transcripts of spoken data in addition to written data. This assessment is legitimate since the concepts embodied in the 4 steps, head, sentence structure, semantic framing, and function are also found in transcripts of spoken data. These proposed 4 steps particularly emphasize the notion of head. Since the notion of head is considered universal, and since heads can be found in sentences in spoken data as well, identifying sentential heads first facilitates accurate linguistic analysis of sentence structures, as pointed out by Croft. The proposed 4 steps of frames and constructions analysis predicts that even when frame mismatch and structural divergence are present, if functions are the same, then the 2 constructions can be considered corresponding. Okay, and the third point, while the TED Talk Parallel Corpus is a good resource for frame semantic annotation, it may not be the ideal resource as a starting point to outline constructions for building a bilingual or multilingual constructicon because of the characteristics of the genre of subtitles. Okay, so applying this methodology to translated subtitles of 2 or more languages may therefore be a better strategy to build a multilingual constructions from the parallel corpus, rather than between an original and a translation. Okay, let me summarize my talk. While the TED Talk parallel corpus is good for frame semantic annotation, it may not be an ideal place to start aligning constructions. Number 2, pairs of constructions in English and Japanese that share similar pragmatic functions exist in the TED Talk bilingual transcripts. And it seems that the proposed analysis method seems valid not only for written language, but also for transcripts of spoken data. The frames and constructions analysis method proposed here, namely the one that focuses on the head, seems valid to search for corresponding constructions in typologically unrelated languages. And the 4 steps of the analysis predicts that even in the case of frame mismatch and even when structural divergence exists, if the functions are the same, then the 2 constructions can be seen comparable. So the next step is to compare what I call functions here with what Croft calls information packing, because he argues that syntax is primarily motivated by information packing and secondarily by semantics. Okay, so that concludes my talk. Thank you for listening.